Um, I want to, just before we start, I want to introduce a friend of mine. Some of you have been interacting with Devin in the chat. Devin is from South Africa, and he and his family are considering moving to Canada. Well, they are moving to Canada, and we're delighted for it. And so Devin's joined us this morning, and we've becoming good friends through Zoom during this pandemic stage. And I hope one day you're going to get to meet he and his whole family. You will in the next few weeks. They'll be participating with us in a number of ways. Might even get Devin to preach on one Sunday coming up soon. So that's one of the joys of Zoom. We can get people from all over the world doing a number of things. So if you haven't seen Devin in his picture, scroll to a different page and send him a note, wave, do all this, Southside welcome, all that good stuff. And Devin, we're glad that you're with us this morning. So good to have you here. I don't know if Tim or Craig or somebody, if you can let me share my screen, that would be a huge help. That way we can have a peek. Shelley's prayed for me already, and so I'm going to dive in. And I was going to pray, but what a good job she did praying already. So let's just start. I'm going to encourage you to grab your Bible. We're in James chapter 3, verse 13 to 18. And I tell you, this being in James has been such a joy in so many ways. I like him. He's a very practical, down-to-earth kind of guy. And but the problem is that he's hard-hitting. He doesn't mince words, does he? He actually goes at things, and he tells it like it is. He tells the truth. And so when I get ready to preach, I'm having both the joy of being in the text and preparing and thinking, okay, Lord, what do you have for me? What do you have for the church? But then I have to actually put it into practice. I have to do it. And I am like the rest of you. There's times when I come to the text and I go, there's a lot here that I have to deal with personally. And I don't like doing that. It's hard work. It's transformation. And so that's tough. And also, at 55, I'm getting to the point where I'd really like to preach some really nice sermons to you and make you all feel good and really like me a lot. But I tell you, there's some stuff in here that if I really love you enough, I'm going to tell you the truth. And James does that. And so I don't like doing all this preaching sometimes when there's such hard things in here, but at the same time, it's good for us. James started off a few weeks ago, if you remember, in chapter 1, talking about the fact that we all face trials. If you remember, trials were those things, those times, those moments, those situations where we have to make a decision. We're going to go in the way of the world, or we're going to go in the way of Jesus. And it's hard. Sometimes we know which way we should go, but we find it very, very difficult to put it into practice. And so James says, look, when you're lacking wisdom, and he defined wisdom as not only the knowledge of something, but the strength to actually carry it out. He said, when you're lacking in wisdom, go to God and ask, who will give you the Spirit in full measure. And so we've looked at all kinds of difficult situations, all kinds of trials, haven't we? We've talked about the fact that we're tempted at times to show favoritism, or at times we take our money and we hoard it for ourselves, not showing the care for the poor that we need to. Last week we looked at the trial that comes when people are upsetting to us. They hurt us, and what do we want to do? We want to respond with our tongues, sharp tongues that say hurtful things or boastful things. Well, today we come into this second half, the latter verses of chapter 3, and he gives us yet another situation. And so what we want to do is we want to look at the question that he raises here in verse 13. Who is wise and understanding among you? You see, in the midst of the trials in First Church of Jerusalem, all the way back those 2,000 years ago, some people were trying to make a change. They were trying to lead. There was all kinds of persecution that was going on. The people were sort of in financial dire straits. And so a group of people rolled up their sleeves and they said, come on, we can fix this. We can deal with this. And they tried to assume leadership roles. Maybe they were even encouraged by the congregation who were looking for better times. But their teaching both in the words that they said, but even more so in the lives that they lived. Well, they were confusing because they would say one thing and yet, in a sense, would model something else. James is essentially asking here in verse 13, which way will you go? Which way will you walk? Whose life will you model yours after? Who are you setting up as leaders in the congregation? Or, straight to the point as he is, are you seeking fulfillment in the ways of the world and the way the world sees you? Or does real fulfillment come in the ways of Jesus and the way that God sees us? Right away in verse 13, you can see that James answers his own question. He gives us the bottom line right in verse 13, even before he goes on and proves it in the rest of the verses. He says, let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that come from wisdom. In other words, model your life, he says. Model your life after those who walk in the ways of Jesus. And demonstrate this by their good deeds done in humility and wisdom that comes from the right source. But there's a problem. See, things don't always end up the way they first appear. What looks good on the surface may in fact be the very root cause of all the trouble we are facing. James says it clearly, and so we need to hear it. You can either model your life after the teaching and action of those who walk in the way of the world, or those who walk in the way of Jesus. Well, where does he go from here? He says, actually, we need to start this whole conversation about who we're modeling our lives after or which direction we're going to go. We need to look at our motives. And so he says, there are two sources or two ways that we can kind of look at motives. One is in the ways of the world. The ways of the world, he says in verse 14, but if you harbor envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Those who walk in the ways of the world are looking for popularity and power. That's what he's saying. We look to people who are in the ways of the world, and we can immediately see that what they're after, their motives, the reason that they're doing this, as James says, envy and selfish ambition. But it's really about popularity and power. We see this all the time, don't we? People are out to build their status or their reputation in the world's eyes. They come across as arrogant. We see this in athletes. You know, they get interviewed after a game, and what do? Instead of talking about the team nowadays, they talk about themselves and, oh yeah, I did a really good job. And they talk about themselves in the third person. Or entertainers, the same kind of thing. Wealthy people, sometimes we get that from them. They're out to build this sort of empire of their own. And I wrestled all week whether I'd talk about politics, but I don't even need to. I can just stop there, and you know full well with the American election coming up, we see this all the time. Same thing with people that want power. This is not just popularity, but it's power. They want to control the situation. They want to be in charge of everything. They want to be in charge of people as well as the situation. And sometimes it's the same people who want both the popularity and the power. And the problem is, as James is saying here, is some of the people that are vying for leadership in the church are those that are actually in it for themselves so that they will become popular and they'll have power. He says there's a different way. The Jesus way, where the motive is not about envy and selfish ambition, but instead it's about humility and honoring God. That's what he infers in the way that he's talking in this text. Humility. What does it mean to be humble? Well, we're going to look at that a whole bunch more next week, but he already gets into it this time because it's so important. You can just picture James in his whole upbringing. He would have known the texts of the Old Testament, where he would have learned of Moses. And particularly there was this scene, I don't know if you remember it, in Numbers chapter 12. Moses has been leading the people of Israel, and they've been wandering around the wilderness because they've been sinful and they've messed up and taken a lot longer to get to the promised land than they, were ever intended to. And there's this one scene where Moses, who continues to seek after God, God continues to use him to speak to him for the people of Israel. His brother and sister, Miriam and Aaron, are there gossiping. Remember, we learned all about that last week. And they're nit-natting with each other about Moses. They're complaining. Oh, Moses this and Moses that. And why does God not use us? And then there's this beautiful line in Numbers chapter 12, verse 3, where it says, and God considered Moses to be the most humble man that ever lived. Jesus, too, talks about humility. That beautiful passage that we know so well when we're weary and we're tired, and Jesus says, come to me, all of you who need a rest. I'll give you strength, because I'm gentle and humble of spirit. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, humility is the ability to be the greatest architect in the world, to build the most beautiful cathedral that ever existed, so that people weep with tears when they see it. And then to be equally as happy if your neighbor was the one who had built it. See, it's not all about us, but rather it's about God. For humility can't help but lead to honoring God instead of seeking that honor for ourselves. That's the way of Jesus. We talked about a story of Jesus raising the widow of Nain's son back to life after he had died. And the most amazing part of that whole story, I mean, he raised the son to life, so that's incredible in itself, of course. But it said the whole crowd gave God the glory. Well, as much as there are political leaders that have sought to be sort of proud and selfish ambition, I remember in junior high doing a speech on Jimmy Carter. I can't remember what number of president he was. Maybe Dan remembers. But one of the things about Carter is that the world remembers Jimmy Carter as a feeble and ineffective president. But I happen to think that when we read this text and we look through God's lenses, through walking in the way of Jesus, I tend to think that God looks at Jimmy Carter very differently than the way human beings do. Is it important for us to care about who gets the credit? Is it important for us to care about who's the most popular? You bet it is. But it's not about us. It's about King Jesus. Well, after the motives, James comes along and he says, you know, your motives will lead to a certain set of characteristics that happen. So he goes on and he says in verse 15, he says, such wisdom does not come from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Those are three pretty tough words. So what's he talking about? James says that there are characteristics of these people that are, well, they're envious and they're vying for selfish ambition. And when they begin to live that way, here's what we see. Their power, their strength comes from earthly things. And what does that mean? Well, he says right there in the verse, it's not from above, it doesn't come from God, but instead it comes from somewhere else. And what he's talking about is it's rooted in culture. Everyone's doing it. Why shouldn't I do it? It must be right. How could so many people be wrong? Isn't it true? We get caught up, we get swept up, we get carried along with the ways of the world, with the way that culture looks at things. It's so subtle. The pressure to conform either our beliefs or our actions, because everybody's doing it. That's the way the world thinks of things. So therefore, why shouldn't we think of those things? Last weekend, I don't know if you heard this story, but there was a woman who had held a seat in the provincial parliament in BC in the legislature for, I think it was almost 20 years. And she lost her seat. She lost her riding last weekend in the BC election. And why did she lose it? Because she had voted against, get this, she voted against rainbow crosswalks in the city of Langley. Now, somebody stands up for their convictions. It goes against the ways of the culture. And what happens? For sure, she's going to lose her seat. She's no longer popular and she no longer has any power. Doesn't matter who she was seeking it for. But that's what happens when we get caught up in the ways of the world. We get carried along by what the culture thinks. And it's exactly what Paul talked about in Romans chapter 12 when he said, do you remember? Do not be conformed to the patterns of this world. Don't get sucked in, and all your decisions and all your actions are shaped by the way the world sees things. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. One of the biggest problems that we have as the church, not just Southside, but the church in the West, is way too often we make our decisions based on what we see in the world rather than what we see in Scripture. And friends, we can't fall into that pattern. So James says it's earthly, but secondly, it's natural. What's he mean by that? Well, what's done and accomplished is done in our own strength. And sometimes that's okay. I mean, we see competent people and they're working hard and they do beautiful jobs. But we know that there's no supernatural participant in that. It's all done in our own strength. And typically what ends up happening was things are done in our own strength. They may be beautiful for a time, but there's no lasting fruit. We see this in church circles just as much as we see it in the world. We don't get the results that we want, so we work harder and harder and harder, trying to do a better and better and better job. I could do this on sermons. You could give a really great sermon from the world's perspective. Make sure you have all the patterns of good speech writing and good speech delivery all done, and yet it doesn't have any impact. Well, why? Because of the fact that the Spirit of God was not a part of it. It was all done in natural strength. We can see this not just in preaching, but in every area of our lives. There are times when we try to do things in our own strength, and we know full well that we end up failing. It's the same thing with transforming our neighborhoods. We go in our neighborhoods and we try to do good deeds. Well, of course we should do that. But if God's not in it, it just becomes a bunch of hard work that eventually tires us out. That's what James is talking about. It's earthly. We get swept along by the culture, but it's natural. We end up doing it in our own strength instead of it being what God's doing in and through us. And then thirdly, he says it even gets worse than that. When we fall into that pattern, we end up getting tired. It's like we're fighting against things all the time. And what we begin to do is open ourselves up so that demonic influence can come in and take this as if it's turbocharging it and push us in the wrong direction over and over. One of the sad stories in the news the last little while was the story of Jerry Falwell, and I don't need to go through all the details or throw him under the bus. But here's an illustration where we just see all of these things, the natural and the earthly and the demonic, all working together. For he recently took a $10 million severance from Liberty University, in spite of all that had happened. But this week, filed a lawsuit against the university, saying they had damaged his reputation. Friends, what happens to us? We get off kilter, we get sucked in by the culture, we do things in our own strength, and we open ourselves up for Satan to just use us in awful ways. But James says there's a different way. We don't just walk in the ways of the world, we walk in the ways of Jesus. And when we begin to walk in the ways of Jesus, a whole different set of characteristics are produced. He says it in verse 17. The wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Oh my, we could spend a week on each of these characteristics, but I'm not going to. Here's just a few lines that give us sort of a holistic picture of each of these. Purity, what does he mean? It means without defect, no mixed motives, bearing witness to who God is in our very actions. I read an illustration this week that reminded me of something that happened very, very early on in Southside. The most gifted singer that Southside has ever had, no question, wanted to have her part of the music team. And she was so gifted that she kept coming with the attitude that said, I don't need to show up at practice. What do I need to practice for? What made me so sad, besides the fact that she didn't sing very much at Southside and she had an amazing voice, but it felt like it was about her. instead of it being about God. And so purity says there's no mixed motives here. It's in every situation in humility, giving honor to God. James says it's peace-loving also. This means finding the right balance, the right formula between telling somebody the truth without stirring up tension. Now that's hard, and I confess to you, I have to work at this one. It's so difficult for me. I oftentimes when I want to tell the truth, I end up in the end stirring up tension in the midst of it, and it just frustrates me no end. And there are numbers of us in the church that are so good at it. And I just marvel at when people are able to say hard things to one another and yet do it with such love that it's like, they're welcomed. It's like you could say a really hard thing to somebody and they're your best friend. So I got to keep working on that. But that's what James says comes when there's a deep sense of humility and honoring God. Or he said, thirdly, there's a sense of being considerate. Some texts call it gentle. And being considerate means somebody who administers justice fairly and in a calm fashion. In other words, you're in the midst of administering justice and you get in trouble for it. Somebody gives you a hard time, and yet in the midst of that hard time, you're able to stay calm and still measure out justice fairly. That's what James is after. Or he says, be submissive, meaning we surrender our rights for the benefit of the whole. It's not just about me, it's about us. And therefore, I don't have to have my way, but what God wants for us. We use this phrase a number of times recently, and I can't get it out of my mind. It's just an amazing phrase, so hard to do. It means we abandon outcomes. I don't have to have my way. Well, the last couple, he sort of partners together. He says, full of mercy and of good fruit. This is all about loving our neighbors. This is about learning to live in the midst of people in such a way that they can't help but see Jesus in our midst. And the good fruit that comes is not just because, hey, you're a good person, you've done a good deed. No, actually, it's much richer than that. Not only are you a good person, but I see Jesus in the midst of your good deeds. The last two he gives are impartial and sincere, meaning without hypocrisy. And here's the kicker, not double-minded. Do you remember back in chapter 1 where he said, look, the people that don't have wisdom, they get stuck in their minds because they know what they should do, but they act in a different way. That's a double-minded person. A person that thinks one way and acts in a different way. Hypocrisy. And James says here that, when a leader has the right motives, humility, honoring God, what begins to take shape in their life and in the life of the church is no double-minded people. If we surrender our motives, envy, selfish ambition, we allow the Spirit of God to fill us and to begin to see the fruit of walking with Jesus, we can't help but elevate the name of Jesus and the people around us. Well, come to the last part of what he talks about here. And he says, for those that are walking in the ways of the world, they're going to see this earthly characteristic, a natural characteristic, and a demonic. They're going to see that kind of stuff happening in their lives. And the result of that, or the fruit of that, he says down in verse 16, is discord and evil practices. Listen, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder and every evil practice. I probably don't need to do much on those to tell you what they are, but you can imagine. Disorder or discord comes in the midst when people are out to get their own way. If a leader's out to get his own way in the church, then what happens with the people? They follow suit, and they're out to get their own way. And so what begins to happen is that we create chaos out of order. Now, I hope you heard that. We create chaos out of order. And I'm doing that on purpose. It's a play on words because you know that when we go back to Genesis 1, we can't help but see that God created order out of chaos. You see, when he's elevated, not us, when he gets the honor, not us. He speaks into situations and creates order. But when we get the glory, when we seek the glory, much like folklore tells us that all kinds of gods did in those early days, chaos is created out of order. And he also says that not only does chaos or disorder or discord come among God's people, but every evil practice begins to show up. Big, long list of those we could give. We don't need to go through all those today. But we know full well when our motives are to be popular or to gain power, we open the door for Satan to take charge of our lives. All kinds of evil begins to come, and at first we don't even know it. One thing I do want to say about evil practices before we move to a close. James isn't talking to the world here. He's talking to the church. He's not talking to everybody out there, all those big bad people in the world. He's talking to us. What he's doing is naming ways in which we've allowed syncretism to creep in. What's that mean? Ways in which we have copied the ways of the world and yet tried to say it's part of our faith. Well, there's fruit on the other side of the coin here too. You see, when we walk in the ways of Jesus and we allow humility and honoring God to take charge, and we begin to see that whole long list of character traits begin to be shaped in us and in the church, peace and a harvest of righteousness are sown. Look at the way he says it in verse 18. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. When you see somebody, maybe you haven't seen them for a long time, you greet them. Often there's a casual greeting. Hey, how are you doing? Sometimes it's a little bit more formal depending on who the person is. I trust you are well. For a Jew, one of the greatest things that you could say to somebody in a greeting is Havenu Shalom Aleichem, which means, may you experience the fullness of the peace of God in your life. In other words, may God fill you up to overflowing with that shalom, that sense of peace, that everything is right in the world. That's what James is talking about here. When you live in the ways of Jesus, that's what's produced, not only in you, but in the church. And beyond that, it's not just a peace that happens. What's the opposite of evil practices? It's the harvest of righteousness, meaning it's good deeds, but not just good deeds like anybody can do. Hey, look at that person in the neighborhood. They've done a good deed. That's wonderful. But when we do it in the power or the strength or the wisdom of the Spirit of God that fills us up, we begin to create a harvest of righteousness, which means good deeds done in the name of the Father and for the Father's honor, so that people will know that Jesus is King. There's a huge difference right now. You know, there's a movement, and I'm part of it in lots of ways, teaching about what neighborhood is all about. It's great. I love it. But it stops short when it doesn't talk about a transformed neighborhood when people are introduced to Jesus. And if we don't have that, there's not a lot of difference between humanism and what I hear some people talking about. Well, we need to quit. Time to wrap up for today. James is going to pick this up next week as we begin into chapter 4 and talk about some of the issues that are faced. But one thing to carry with us as we get ready for next week. We are tempted to read chapter 3, 13 to 18 through individual lenses. It's not. It's corporate. And so not only is James saying, hey, Cam, get rid of the envy and selfish ambition and instead be filled with humility and honoring God so that all those things will happen. And here's the fruit that will be produced in your life. He says, hey, Southside, what's your reputation? What are you known for? Because if you're living in the way of Jesus corporately, collectively, communally, you will gain a reputation that's not about you. It's about him. And you will begin to see transformation, not only in individual lives, which we will and we want, but in neighborhoods, in places, in people groups. And he's going to pick that up next week. You know, we've been talking about a lot of issues today that are sort of, in a sense, through our lenses, first world lenses, at trials that we face or issues that are of concern to us, talking about our envy or our selfish ambition. And it's right to do that. But this is a day in which we also need to pay attention to the fact that I not only belong to us at Southside, but we at Southside belong to the Church Universal. And if there was one of you that was struggling and in need of something and just needed help,